Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Hank Corwin ACE, and from Picturehouse 441, Joshua Handler.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to EditFest Global. My name is Joshua Handler. I'm the co-founder and lead programmer for Picturehouse 441, and I am very grateful to ACE for inviting us here to have this masterclass. We are joined by Hank Corwin, the editor of The Big Short, among many other movies. Hank, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I'm incredibly excited that we get to dig into this film together.
Josh, happy that you resonated with the film and that you enjoy talking to editors.
So you guys are among the most fascinating people to chat with, and so any way to spotlight editors is something that I love. It's shocking to me that this film, The Big Short, was released almost 8 years ago now, and how unfortunately well it's aged. When was the last time that you saw this film? I'm sure you probably watched it in the days prior to us chatting today, correct?
Yes, but I hadn't watched it. I hadn't watched it for about 5 or 6 years, and for the most part, for me, as the editor, it holds up. There are places now that I figure I'd perhaps cut a little differently, but the thrust of the message holds true. I mean, Adam McKay was so prescient about what's going on, and unfortunately, what was true then is truer now. So I love this film.
I do too. I don't think I'd seen it since around its release, and I remember seeing it a couple times even before it was released. I think another time or two when it was released, and then because I'd seen it so many times then. I took a break from it, and it was just terrifying to revisit this film, but also refreshing to see that this film has held up so beautifully. I want to dig into something that you just said, kind of an atypical way to start. But you had mentioned that there were some things that you would have done differently with this film. Are there any that you're able to pinpoint for us today? I'd love to hear what your thoughts were, and also what really stood out to you that you were impressed by, maybe with your own work, or that you were really proud of.
I've always hated technique for technique's sake, and I've been accused of being a technique-y editor. And generally everything I do, every frame that I use is. I'd like to think that I think things through. Everything is thought out. I mean, I make a lot of mistakes, but they're my mistakes. I leave very little to chance. I just saw when Charlie and Jamie are greeting Ben Rickard, and he's coming down the escalator, and then we cut to a street scene. And honestly, I just got so caught up with that. I think it was a Gorillaz track. And I just cut to the beat for a second. And, it was fun when I did it. It was an indulgence. And I think it sort of cheapened the film a teeny bit, at least for me as the editor.
That's so interesting.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. Go ahead. Continue.
No, again, film is... It's really, every frame is about truth, and if it can't be justified, and, you can be well, I was about to say you can be playful with film. Yes, you can, but not where I'm actually very much a purist. If it's not conveying an idea, then it doesn't belong. If it's just an expression of pure joy, I mean, there are places for that. Not in this film.
That's interesting to me, though, that Gorillaz track, Feel Good Inc., I believe it was, that plays over that sequence. That's interesting that you feel that that's an indulgence, because I feel that that's in a film that is so frequently heavy. Albeit very darkly funny in a lot of points. For a film that is so dramatically heavy, that track did provide a little bit of needed levity at that midpoint of the film.
Absolutely. And the thing is, I think we'd still stand by that track. ultimately, I think so much in life, certainly in filmmaking, for me, comes down to brain chemistry.
Mhm.
And you know, we're humans are a moving target, and as I hesitate to use the term, but as artists, we're always changing, and our perception is always changing. So I know at the time, what was that, 7 years ago or something? It seemed appropriate. Now I'm getting a little closer to the end of the line, and it doesn't seem so appropriate.
It's interesting that it sounds like the Hank of 2023 would have cut that sequence differently than the Hank of 2015 or 2014, whenever you were cutting this film.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just being honest. You know, I mean, we can get into philosophical discussion about the nature of film, and like, well, we'll go into that a little later. But I, it's film obviously is very subjective. I used to get terribly pissed off when I'd work with certain directors, certain German directors, and they would they would see a shot as being the truth and the be all end all. And for me, a shot is just like if you're building a house, it's a plank,
Mhm.
you know, and it's very, you know, whether it's film or it's an image that's captured. It's it's only a tiny component, you know, and yeah, no, I'm trying to contextualize how I'm thinking about making anything I do. Uh, I don't know if I explained it there.
No, I think you've explained it beautifully, and you were talking about certain German directors that you've worked with, that obviously wasn't necessarily a great fit. But you mentioned earlier, the name Adam McKay, the co-writer director of this film, who you've now worked with on his past three films, Vice, The Big Short, and Don't Look Up. Obviously, you two have some kind of a shared sensibility if you've worked together now on so many films over a relatively short period of time. What was it about Adam that drew you to work with him?
Well, he's
What?
not German.
I like that answer.
No, I mean, it's Adam McKay. He did. First, I was shocked when I got the call, especially for this film. You know, I met him in New Orleans. I was on my way to, I think it was to Prague to cut a commercial. And I flew into New Orleans to meet him. He had been working on this film, he'd been shooting, and I didn't think I was the right guy. You know, I told him, look, I don't do comedy. I don't understand comedy. I don't see myself as having comedic rhythms. And he said, look, just do what you do and let me deal with the comedy. And it's Adam McKay, so of course. Uh, no, you know, we it's really something because he left me alone. He came in, I showed him a couple of scenes, and I showed him the scene where Bill is at Goldman Sachs,
Uh-huh.
and he's peddling his wares, and we ultimately go to, you know, we go to the ludicrous track, and I go to the stock footage. None of this was scripted, and it was sort of, for me, it was a litmus test just to see how successful our relationship was going to be. And he said, you know, I'll see you in 3 weeks. And he just basically he leaves me alone. He comes in, ultimately, he's like Attila the Hun after I have cuts. But he leaves me alone, and we seem to share the same sensibilities.
And you said that you share sensibilities. How would you define your shared sensibilities?
Adam is a very spiritual guy in his own way. He cares very much about the world. He's someone actually intellectually that I aspire to. You know, I feel very strongly, pretty much about climate change, uh, about what makes people laugh, what's very serious, the juxtaposition of comedy and tragedy, and the fact Adam's done comedy, he's done improv for so many years, you know, and he's always walked a tightrope without a net, and that's pretty much how I approach cutting film, you know. And some directors love it, some don't. Adam loved it.
Can you dig into that a little bit? Cutting films is like walking a tightrope without a net for you.
Well, say in this, it's a whole different discussion about using the use of stock footage, the use of, well, it goes back to when I was saying that film isn't the truth. You know, it's like film is ultimately very elastic. It's very plastic. If you want to convey an emotion, you don't have to have like a linear piece of film. You can use a piece of film and then cut into a piece before the slate started where your actor may be looking off into space, or where he's laughing, or where he's just he or she is just generally unhappy. And the synergy of those two shots juxtaposed is greater than the sum of the parts. I think on some very deep spiritual level, Adam got that, and he gets that, and he appreciates it. And we've been able to explore just a different way of making film.
It's amazing to me that you two, have found each other as artistic collaborators, and obviously work so well together, and have so many of these shared sensibilities. Now, obviously, we've just spoken about what you connected with Adam, but what was it about this material? Obviously, you said that you have shared interests and things of that sort, which ties into The Big Short. But what was the hook for you with The Big Short? What was the hook for you when you either saw the first bit of footage, when you read the screenplay? What was it that got you in?
You know, I love human behavior. I love seeing it and hearing it and smelling it. And I love the pathos and the bathos of like being like a human. And that's you know, and the ability to have characters reveal themselves as being pompous blowhards or very righteous. And I was able to pick that up in the script loud and clear. What Adam had started a cut, he very graciously allowed me not to look at what he had done, and he allowed me to start over. So whenever I approach a project, I always try to find like an emotional and ultimately a spiritual hook. And I was able, I mean, this film ultimately is a great tragedy. It's Shakespearean. You know, people lost their homes, people lost their lives, people lost their loved ones. You know, people equate their possessions with their lives. People were murdered on many levels. You know, so I just thought that the film ultimately could be a very deep ocean of emotion. You know, look, in other hands, you could do it superficially. I don't have interest in doing film like that.
No, and I think that lack of superficiality is one reason why The Big Short resonates. Why, almost a decade after its release, it's still so powerful. Um, you mentioned a little bit earlier that you like to use bits and pieces of footage, before the take had started, or something like that. And you also mentioned Adam's use of improv. How much improv was was done on The Big Short, if there was any? And were there any pieces of footage that were not necessarily part of a take that you used that you were particularly proud of, or that you thought were particularly impactful?
Let me think about that. But about the pieces of footage. But Adam Adam is a spectacular director. I've never worked with anyone quite like him. He'll cover what's scripted, but he's got confidence enough in his ability to communicate ideas to the actors, and he's confident enough in his actors that he encourages them to improvise. He'll throw them off. He uses a microphone. He's speaking to the actors, and he'll throw out different lines, and he'll have them riff on them. And even if you have an actor who's having difficulties or trying to formulate an idea, how do I use this new idea that Adam threw out at me? I'm able to take the footage of the guy processing the idea, and sometimes I can incorporate that into the cut. And it makes it deeper. I love really getting into the truthfulness of actors and of characters. And I don't really like stories so much as experiences. And the more experiential I can make a film, the more successful it is for me. And Adam gives me these delightful moments. Years ago, when I cut film, I would use when film is going through a gate, it's running at 24 frames a second. When a director or a DP or a camera operator turns the camera on, it ramps up. And when he turns it off, it slows down. And you get 2 or 3 frames where you have overexposure because the film is slow and it's a little blurry. And I used to be able to step print that and just sort of make, you could really get almost like painting, impressionistic. I don't have that luxury all that often although Adam does shoot film, unlike most directors. But it's just a way of manipulating the film. Film is not precious.
Well, let me ask you this. You said an image is not precious. If an image is not precious, then when cutting a film such as The Big Short, what do you treat the most important? You said that every image, that every cut is intentional. Every image is important to you, but they're not precious. Can you break that down a little bit?
Look, an image can be precious. An image unto itself can be lovely, but for me, cutting a film like The Big Short, everything has to. It's like pointillism in painting. It's like you can have these beautiful little points, but ultimately are creating this giant portrait. And so I think that an image and a sound, and the lack of an image, which is also very important, I think they all have to service and serve the portrait, the idea. So that's, I'm not anti-image on any level. I have my breath taken away, but sometimes you'll have a glorious image and you can become intoxicated with the image itself, and you can lose the thrust of what you're trying to say. Or you can talk yourself into thinking that the image itself is saying enough. Sometimes it does. I'm not saying it doesn't, but in this film, I found that basically everything has to service the idea, and everything I have to try to bring. I don't really cut a film for an audience so much as I cut it for myself. I have a very sensitive, for me, of just a very sensitive gauge to bullshit in film.
Mhm.
And ultimately it's got to work for me. And, I'll leave it to the director to ascertain whether it works for an audience. Hopefully, I find that generally in my thinking in society and stuff, I'm somewhere in the great middle, so that served me well.
Did that bullshit detector ever go off when working on The Big Short? Was there ever a point at which you called bullshit on a scene, on whatever cut you were working on as a whole? Do you remember any bullshit detector going off?
If you have a performance that's not truthful, it's bullshit. If you use a piece of stock footage, if you use one of those little pieces at the head of a shot or at the tail of a shot, and you actually see that, you see the cut, and as opposed to feeling what it's saying, that's bullshit. So it's got to ultimately feel in its own way emotionally seamless.
I think it's time to roll our first clip. Let's roll our first clip, the opening of the film.
Smoke?
In the late 70s, banking wasn't a job you went into to make large sums of money. It was a fucking snooze.
How about those Mets?
So, Hank, I was watching you as you were watching that clip, and I saw you smiling periodically through that, which I just think is so delightful.
I love what I do, and I love. God, this sounds so narcissistic. I love my work generally, and I'm not happy until I do love it. And sometimes it succeeds, sometimes it doesn't. For me, whether this film succeeded or not, I just love this little section, because Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say it encompasses so many different ideas in a very short period of time.
It does, and it establishes the style as well of this film. There's so much to dig into with that opening sequence, and it's by turns funny and electric and exciting and also totally disturbing. And I love when there's the man on the screen. I can't remember who it is, but where he says the economy is strong, and then you cut right in the middle of the word strong.
Right.
That
was Hank Paulson. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Hank. That was okay. Hank Paulson. Can you discuss that decision to cut right as he's in the middle of the word strong? Because you do that throughout the film.
Again, it comes down to brain chemistry for me. It's like we know what he's going to say, and I think it's more. It pulls you. You're missing it, and it just jerks you forward. I think those extra like 4 or 5 frames would be lazy. I wanted it to be clipped. Again, it goes along with my thinking that every frame counts. And I'm pretty militant about that.
Absolutely. And what I think is so interesting as well about that opening sequence is the fact that it establishes the style. It establishes Adam's style for the film. It establishes your editing style for the film. I mean, there's the fourth wall breaking, with Gosling talking to the audience. There's the stock footage that you mentioned that you use throughout the film. There's so many different things that pervade this film that are introduced in that opening sequence. Can you discuss how you work to properly introduce the audience to both your style and Adam's? Because again, this style of this film is unlike anything that I think I've ever seen before. And a lot of people have, I think, tried to copy the style of this film in the past, 8 years since its release, and I don't think any of them have done it nearly as successfully as this original.
That's very kind. Thank you. I don't know. Let me just think where to start. Well, I come from a world initially of commercials and music videos in New York. Mm-hmm. I grew up working with a lot of bad film, and when I say bad film with mistakes, film with untruths. So what I found, especially with using stock footage, I find the pieces that aren't beautifully composed, because life isn't beautifully composed. If you're looking at something and you hear a sound, you turn your head, you'll catch a glimpse of something over there. You'll hear something behind you. You may look back. It's just, again, it's a glimpse. You may not even see it. You hear it, so, and then, oh gosh, I mean, we have the moments where we make a point. It's like cutting off Hank Paulson in the middle of a word. You get an idea, and I want the idea to sink in, so I cut to black. Because I don't want, that's the idea. Cut to black. Something else. Cut to black. Just and one thing we haven't discussed, and it's so important, is the third horse in the troika, Nick Britell.
Yes, absolutely.
I've worked with Nick and Adam on these 3 films and the HBO Winning Time. And what's really something, I'll be looking with Nick. I mean, I'm so blessed to have him in my life. Because what we would do, I would show Nick dailies. Nick came in for this film months before, and I would tell him, look, I want to feel great pathos here. I want to feel just total exuberance. And he will plug his computer into my board, and he may even play a note against a shot. And then he'd excuse himself. He'd go into another room and mess around with his keyboard and come back. And we would just refine. So he would help me in the editing. And I hope I was able to help him a teeny bit in the music. It became, I mean, it's almost like the way Nick, Adam, and I work is like, we're like a jazz trio, and we're riffing off of each other. I used to, for years, when I was starting my career, I worked with Bob Richardson, who's just a spectacular DP.
Oh, yeah.
And we would work the same way. We would, except, just metaphorically. But I've never had a collaborator as close to me as Bob until I met both Adam and Nick.
It's wonderful that you found 2 other people who have similar sensibilities to you and who you feel bring out the best in you as an editor. But going on this thing with Nick, what do you feel that he brings out in your work when you work together?
I think we have like this weird spiritual connection. I'm not quite sure how to define it. I see his work with Barry Jenkins, and it's completely different.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's tremendously versatile. But we're able to actually treat. It's almost like treat like an image and a sound is some kind of like quantum mechanics. It's like we strip away everything about what we're doing except the most elemental stuff, what we're trying to communicate. It's almost like, I think Nick and I could almost cut a film together and do music with just light and darkness. I mean, that's my fantasy. I don't know if that'll ever happen. Yeah, so I'm just very lucky to have him in my life.
Absolutely, and again, obviously, it works beautifully. The 3 of you working together. We had spoken a little bit about your use of stock footage in this film, and the opening is filled with fantastic news footage and these stock photos. What was the process behind finding those and incorporating them into that sequence? They're exceptionally well chosen throughout the film.
You know, initially, the way I work, I'll talk to my assistants. I have wonderful assistants who will talk. I'll say impressionistically what I'm looking for, what I want to feel, and I'll let them interpret that. And instead of getting one shot, I hate it when like there'll be a studio stock footage person, and she or he'll give you one shot. I want hours and hours and hours of material, and that's what they give me. And then I was working on a giant Nike campaign in Berlin, and I met people at a company called Stalker, who all they do is give you stock footage, and I'll get hours and hours and hours and hours of stock footage, and they'll just let me do what I do. So it's it ultimately, again, it comes down to how it feels. It comes down to brain chemistry and how it feels in a context.
It sounds like when you're going through the stock footage, you're kind of like a kid in a candy store.
Oh my gosh, yes. And I try to treat the footage that's shot the same way. It has the same valence, the same weight. What I ultimately, to make a really harmonious scene for me, is to have like the perfect balance between the shots and the sound and the light and the darkness.
Absolutely. I want to cue up our second clip, which is Christian Bale's introduction as Michael Burry.
Oh, cool.
During the 1930s.
Hank, I love that as the first character intro. Yes, we're introduced briefly to the character Venom, played by Ryan Gosling, but we don't really know who he is. The first real character intro is Bale as Burry. It's totally different than the sequence that came before. It's more fragmented. It's more psychological. Can you walk us through the process, or through the way in which you wanted to properly introduce the character of Michael Burry?
Sure. Well, first of all, I have to say that if I didn't have footage of Christian Bale, this wouldn't have worked. He's a transfixing and transformative actor.
And also have to say, Barry Ackroyd's cinematography is stunning for this film, and that sequence in particular.
And I can't say enough about him. And I apologize to him for not speaking earlier. I couldn't have cut this film without his footage. He had these rhythms. He shot this film before I got on it, so he gave me a template. I was very lucky. But the film it's glorious as well. He's just a gloriously gifted cinematographer. This little scene, I was trying to convey different realities. We start out, the first level, the upper level, is he's interviewing this kid. And then we have another level where he's talking about himself. Then we go to his childhood. Then we go to the swimming. Okay, so it's interesting. I'm fascinated by the nature of memory and the nature of ideas. And it's like you can never totally replicate what a memory is. You can't really replicate a memory truly in film or with music. A memory just is. It's beyond definition, although it's so impactful. But I can approximate it, and sometimes, well, like when we go to the football game, and it'll be, you know, I try to find moments that aren't particularly beautiful, but are very human. The cheerleaders together, um, the parents looking, the crowd watching, and I'll cut the sound out, because I'm just conveying a deeper time, and I will go to black and white, not because it's black and white, but because it just it's this, it's almost like this weird, I was going to say atavistic, like primordial kind of memory in your brain, in your mind. The imagery itself, I love the swimming because it's so embryonic.
Yes.
And Bale was, it's like we had to explain who this character was in a very brief period of time. And I thought, I love like origami, and I thought it was really cool to be able to fold all these little scenes into each other. So that's it.
No, I think it's a wonderful explanation of that. And through this sequence, you really bring us deep, and as you said, in a very short period of time, it's very deep into the character of Michael Burry. You bring us into his mind in a way that we really understand who he is, and then can thus empathize with him over the course of the next 2 hours of the film.
Yeah, no, again, Bale is such a fantastic actor, and Adam really has everything very taut, and I love the piece of music that it came up with. It's just very simple and very resonant. It almost feels like a dentist drill.
A dentist drill. That's a very, very interesting comparison. When you say what makes you say it's like a dentist drill? Because most people
because it bores into your mind. I'm not talking about the pain, but no, because Nick's music is far from painful, but
yeah,
because it's so universal. I think everybody in the world can appreciate the simplicity and the beauty of these cues, and it
absolutely
makes my job easier.
Absolutely. We were talking about character intros. I think we should roll our next clip.
Mortgage-backed securities, subprime loans, tranches. It's pretty confusing, right? Does it make you feel bored or stupid? Well, it's supposed to.
Hank, it's so funny watching that sequence because it brings me back to the first time that I saw the film, and it was, as I'm sure it was to probably everybody that's seen this film, such an incredible shock. It's a real breaking of the fourth wall. It's something that's so unconventional yet so brilliant, and the way in which you introduce that sequence and bring us into it, as well as the way in which that sequence with Margot in the bathtub is cut, is just totally delightful. We were talking about finding comedic timing earlier, and you said that you don't consider yourself comedy editor or anything of that sort, yet that sequence is particularly funny and relies so much on the way in which you cut it for its comedic impact. Can you tell us about finding the right comedic timing for that sequence, and finding the right lead up to that sequence with those wonderful stock images?
Yeah, the thing is, what I didn't want to do is just have like a really obvious fourth wall where someone was just delivering information to camera. So what I tried to do is integrate the cutting flow of the preceding shots, a lot of the stock footage, with the way I put her together, or her performance together. I was really fortunate in that Margot is just delightfully funny and irreverent. So I mean, she was easy to cut. What can you say? She's just such a fantastic, wonderful actress. But I I watched her performance, and from there figured that I had to bring her into the film as opposed to being someone who breaks out of the film.
Mhm.
You know, so I picked those stock shots. I love the stock shot of the dog on the raft under Are You Feeling Stupid? I mean, it's perfect. Everybody in the world can identify with that because it is so stupid and it's funny and it's wonderful. You know, and Margot just sort of flowed into it with a champagne. It became sort of like a, a Daddy Warbucks kind of thing. You know, the champagne is flowing. She's talking. She's obviously brilliant, you know, but she's communicating in a very disarming way, and that's pretty much what we were trying to accomplish.
When she thanks the man for pouring her more champagne, I mean, that's a moment that I think many other editors would have just tossed out, but you left that in there, and it just adds to the character of that scene. Can you discuss the decision to leave that like split second shot in there?
Well, it's part of what we've been discussing. You know, it's like I don't find anything absolute about a linear piece of film. And if I can find a piece of film like that that conveys or either that can lighten the information, or it can it it can accentuate, you know, the character. I mean, I'll use it. I don't care if it's a jump cut. Um, and well, that's pretty much the genesis of that. You know, I just thought it was very funny.
I love that you mentioned bringing Margot into the film as opposed to the opposite of that. It kind of goes in with your description of cutting this film as making origami. And I love the fact that you talk about her bringing her into the film, into the fold of the film, as opposed to having her kind of pop out of it.
Well, but I mean, I think we've seen so many films or a number of films where you do have people breaking the fourth wall. And if it happens more than once, it gets really prosaic and boring. You know, so it was my mission as Adam's editor to just to to have her not really stick out. You know, she is totally part of this film.
Absolutely. And we talked a little bit earlier about a few minutes ago about comedic timing. I feel that comedic timing, with regards to film editing, is instinctual or something that's learned.
It's a hard one. It's a hard one. You know, when I used to cut commercials, they had people who cut comedy. And basically an editor who cuts comedy sits in a room with an agency and they'll try every single permutation. Nothing will be funny, and ultimately the commercials aren't very funny, but they're considered comedic editors. You know, what I learned from McKay is that comedy is very human. It's very peripatetic. You know, it tiptoes. You know, so I think I don't think that I'm naturally gifted as a comedic editor, but I like I you know I'm tickled by the idea of a film of a film just tiptoeing through life and a character that way. So I don't know if that's answering.
I think it's a wonderful answer. One final question about this sequence before we move on. After Margot says, "Now fuck off," you immediately cut into Bale Asbury back on the phone with Lawrence In the wrong hands, this would have felt like tonal whiplash, but in yours, it works beautifully. Did you try cutting these two scenes together in any different way? Or did you ever have a concern that the audience would get some kind of tonal whiplash from the Margot scene back to Bury on the phone with Lawrence?
No, I mean, this was my first pass.
Mhm.
I think Margot, she's like the ginger between courses. You know, she, because ultimately, too much of Bill's anxiety would bring the film down. So I wasn't worried about whiplash. I honestly, I was worried about the film getting too heavy.
Sure.
So she was perfect there. And again, I owe
That
that
makes
to McKay. He scripted it.
That makes complete sense. We've talked a lot about how you described this as like making origami, and I want to go back to that again. It almost is also like a game of Jenga. One piece out of place, the entire thing falls down. Each sequence is constructed so delicately, like that with one piece out of place, the whole thing falls. Was the structure of the film's sequences Was it Adam and Charles Randolph's script? Was it a mix of the two? I find the construction of each of this film's scenes, it's so intricate and it's so fascinating, and I was wondering where that came from.
I I think we all participated. Adam had some of these scenes folded into each other, and I folded other scenes into themselves.
Sure.
For the most part, I mean, obviously when they shoot it, it's very linear. And when they script it, it's fairly linear. But we had long discussions, and we came up with this.
That's wonderful. I know another sequence that you and I both wanted to discuss was the one in which Mark Baum starts to open up to his wife about his brother's suicide. So let's cue up that clip.
Things are worse than I thought. I honestly think the economy might collapse.
You've been saying that the system is broken for years, Mark. So why are you so shocked?
So Hank, I know that you wanted to particularly discuss this sequence. I just want to ask you why this particular sequence. I could guess why, but I'd like to hear what your explanation is for choosing this one.
It really is. It's purely about film and film editing. I said earlier on that film was elastic, and a piece of audio doesn't have to. Although generally you have a piece of audio married to the picture, and coming from film, where you had picture and then mag tracks that you could slip around, and you would slip around. I've always been fascinated by the synergy of words being spoken over thoughts, and just making an idea much bigger. You could have had Baum talking to his wife, and she responds. It's almost like you were able to go into his heart. And I found ultimately that scene really strong. I do choke up at the very end, because here you have a guy who is one of the lords of the universe, and he's damaged just like the rest of us, maybe more than the rest of us. And I found that, that when I damaged the film, when I damaged the order of the film, it just imparted this sense of humaneness to it, and also just some of the cuts, some of the shots going into themselves. You know, it's almost like it was cut for your limbic system, for that part of your brain that doesn't think. You know, that it's what makes you breathe, and what makes your heart beat. And that was sort of the thinking behind that kind of cutting. But it's not like I'm aware of what I'm doing. You know, it's like some bullshit explanation of trying to figure out what exactly I was trying to do. I actually do believe this, but you know, it ultimately it's just got to make you feel good on a certain level. And if you know, it's for me, it's really wounding when like I'll read that people think the film is really cutty, because I don't see the film as being very cutty.
Nor do I.
But you know, what do they say? Horses for courses. You know, I know as an editor, I'm not for everybody.
It's interesting that you said earlier, and that you know you're kind of echoing again. You said that you cut the film not for the audience, but that you cut it for yourself, and you know you want to ensure that it has the right kind of emotional impact on yourself, particularly with regards to this sequence. How do you ensure that you don't get jaded to the material, that you don't see this material so much that it loses its impact?
You know, I'm really blessed. You're gonna love this. I'm really blessed with a terrible memory. You know, so I can watch a film, or I can watch a scene and be fresh to it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, almost just time and time and time again. And ultimately, if I have to sit through a movie 50, 100 times, I'll start getting jaded to it. But I generally can find something, especially in what I do, that I still derive great joy from, great pleasure. So I don't know, especially with that kind of cutting, it just goes in so deep. It always affects me in a very limbic way, in a very subconscious way. So it's always making, it's not like it communicates so much as it makes me happy.
This is the first time I've ever heard somebody say that having a bad memory is a good thing that serves them. So I have to say that's a very refreshing thing to hear from you.
It's not totally true, but
You know, another clip that I know that you and I wanted to that you and I both wanted to talk about was the one that begins with truth is like poetry and most people fucking hate poetry. So let's cue that clip up. It's another Mark Baum centered clip.
Hi, it's Mark. I need to talk to Vinny right now.
We're just asking you to explain to us.
I've been here 10 minutes
You
now.
know why? Just how it is that you were fucking.
You know, Hank, that also is a great example. Before we even dig into what comes before the end of that clip, that's also a great example of what we were talking about earlier, cutting right as the punchline happens. You know, the guy almost spills his coffee, spits his coffee out. Then there's this shot up at Kathy, and then boom, that's the end of the sequence. So I think that's just another great example of you cutting where where there would be maximum impact.
You know, I must say the scene where Baum's in the cab into that scene was cut by a very dear friend of mine, a woman named Liza Espinas, who's a lovely editor. She was the additional editor on this film, so I wouldn't want to take credit for her work. But yeah, no, it's the way that ends is true to the way I was trying to put the film together, just pulling you along.
Now, I know that this was a sequence that both you and I singled out in our previous discussions as one that we both wanted to discuss. Obviously, I know my reasons for that, but I would like to know why you picked this sequence as one that you wanted to single out for discussion today.
You know, the little montage up front with the very simple piano track, the drill, the dentist drill. Those were shots that hopefully conveyed the human tragedy of what was going on. You have these people in their own world, in their own universe, that are oblivious. This has always been fascinating to me in so many of Adam's films. You know, we did it on Don't Look Up. We just showed not only normal people or just people oblivious to what was going on, but we showed nature in a state of nature, you know, oblivious to man's folly. And that's what I loved about those shots. You know, you have, what was the first shot? Do you recall in that montage? I know you.
So those first three images that sequence starts with, it's an image of the iPhone, the first iPhone. It's an image of a soldier. It appears either leaving or coming back from war.
Well, it's, you know, go ahead.
No, and I was going to say, and the third one is the two people in what appears to be well-heeled people in a limousine.
Well, the iPhone obviously is, or maybe not obviously, is setting the historical context in a visual way. But I love the alpha and the omega, the juxtaposition of the soldier. In my mind, anyway, he's hugging his wife. He's going off to Afghanistan or something and making great sacrifices. He is one of the victims. These people could have lost their homes. You have the wealthy guy looking out the window of his limousine. You have his wife applying her lipstick, you know, and in a way that if you look at them, to me, he looks a little haunted, you know, and it's like they have the same emotional weight. Their issues are completely different from the issues of the soldier leaving. Then you have like the grandfather and the kid at a diner. And I just like, in very few shots, you're able to convey, I was trying to convey like a society that's being victimized without showing the same old stereotypical shots. And those were the shots we chose. And then, of course, Adam came up with that spectacular quote about poetry. He made it up.
It's a really great quote.
No, I know. You know, anytime Adam gets into trouble, he falls back to a quote that he writes. He makes it up, and then he attributes it to lunatics. It's kind of a great trick that I probably shouldn't be revealing.
It's kind of genius, I have to say.
Oh no,
I was going to say what I love about this sequence, though, is that particularly those couple of shots, you say so much with those couple of shots that most other people would have used some other, I don't know what method they would have used, but something far less subtle. And I think the subtlety of this film is why it has so much impact. How do you ensure that you're not hitting the audience over the head with the message, but still obviously getting it across?
Again, it comes down to how I feel about the film. If it's hitting me over the head, it's probably hitting the audience over the head. I find, because I know the material so well, my problem is sometimes I'm a little too subtle, you know, and I have to, I have to think about that. And then, well, you can get lost in the imagery. Anybody can, you know, so I can be a little too subtle or a little too heavy-handed. That's where I count on a director. You know, ultimately, it's the director's film. And it may not be subtle to me, but it may be subtle to me and it may be heavy-handed to the director or the other way around. Ultimately, I have to defer after lots of arguing to the director.
Did you find yourself in a place at some point where you felt that you were being too subtle and that Adam had to pull you pull you up a little bit from that subtlety, or vice versa, that you were?
No, I think Adam thinks that I'm not subtle enough sometimes. He understands my subtext. So it's good that sometimes we take breaks from each other, at least work breaks. We feel pretty much the same way. I might have told you years ago when I was cutting Natural Born Killers, the end, and I was very proud of myself because, again, I have these subtexts, and there's this train going into it's at the very end. I think I'm using a Nine Inch Nails song, and it's Leonard Cohen. The train is going into a tunnel, and I say, Oliver, that the train represents death. And Oliver just sort of looked at me and he said, Hank, just shut the fuck up. I like the scene, just leave it alone. And that's Adam will, if something is not subtle enough for Adam, he'll be loud and clear. Or if it's not communicating, he'll want to know why I did something. I mean, very rarely will he tell me get rid of that. Almost never. I mean, It always becomes like a Socratic discussion. And Absolutely. I generally lose. Yeah.
You generally lose. I want to cue up our final clip. It's the clip after the meeting with Mr. Chow that Mark Baum has with Mr. Chow, and he leaves the hotel. Can we cue that up?
So I'm going to leave.
You think I'm a parasite, don't you, Mr. Baum?
That scene that we just watched, there's just so much greatness, I think, in that one scene. Not least in that you really highlight Nicholas Britell's score by featuring it as the only thing that we're listening to, or just about the only thing that we're listening to for a good portion of that. Was there ever a version of that sequence in which there was more sound in it, or was it always your intention to showcase his score?
I wasn't thinking so much about showcasing his score so much as making stills out of those different images, where they're leaving the hotel, where the guy's in the car with a woman, and I forget whether Barry shot it at high speed so it was slow motion or I slowed it down. I just, for the life of me, I can't remember if those shots were slowed down, but I wanted to make them stills, and I wanted to cut to black, and then I wanted to go to the next image, and I just having a piece of music underneath it without any sound allows a viewer to feel these images just as very simple graphic images. And Nick's score, of course, made it work. If I didn't have that score, it wouldn't have worked.
And what's incredibly impactful at the end of that sequence is the fact that there is no sound whatsoever. There's no score, there's no sound, there's nothing. There's just, amid all the dialogue, the quick dialogue, the sound and the fury of this film, having a moment like that at the end of that sequence where there's just an image, no dialogue, no music, really hits hard. Can you discuss that decision?
Sure. Again, it goes back to just the bleakness of life and how the music is going away. Ultimately, we end up on a wide shot of this underpass where you have some homeless people, just victims. You just have quiet, and it's just quiet and quiet. And then the next scene will be Mark Baum talking to his wife, and you hear an organ, and it's liturgical. I always wanted it to feel almost like religious. He's talking about his dead brother, So it's almost like you're coming out of this crazy, crazed Guns N' Roses track in Las Vegas, and crazy, very animated cutting, and you're going into an unusual cutting rhythm. And it's like the ginger, like cleansing the palate, the visual and emotional palate, So I'm telling you my tricks. Yeah. So, yeah, before we went to church, I wanted to just go to silence.
Absolutely, and it has such an incredible impact. It's a moment that I think may not stand out upon first or even second viewing, but in viewing this film and analyzing this film over the course of multiple viewings, it's a moment that I think is really deserving of of commendation and also of analysis, because it's I think a very unconventional decision, and one that again works very well.
Thank you for showing it. Thank you for calling attention to it. It's one of my favorite parts of this movie. And again, it's a transition.
What makes you say that it's one of your favorite parts of this film?
Because just of the dynamic range of it, both sonically and emotionally. Coming off of Las Vegas to the quiet, to the liturgical side. I mean, it's just, for me personally, it's just so deep. It's just so profound. And there's so many victims. And you see so many of them. You see, and Mark Baum, he's like the character in Troy, who the goddess Cassandra, who was cursed with always telling the truth, but nobody would believe her. That was her curse. And he's sort of like every man and no man at the same time.
Mark Baum is kind of a tragic figure in this film. I think he's also, despite the fact that he could be, very tough and outwardly unlikable, I think is one of the most empathetic characters in this film.
In a weird way, he's every man, but he really isn't. I mean, look at him. Look at the way he lives. Look at his appetites. He's larger than life, but his empathy is larger than life as well. He's at the moral center of this film.
Mm-hmm.
And again, with what just happened in Las Vegas, going to the silence, it's like I was thinking about an audience as well. It's like, we've just conveyed some very heavy ideas, and I just wanted people to be able to absorb it.
And what's great about the beginning of that clip, and throughout many other points in this film, is the fact that you give this crisis a human face from all levels, from those that are featured in this film that bet against it, that are obviously very wealthy, down to the every person, such as that soldier, such as the people, the person and the kid having breakfast at the diner. You give a human face to this crisis and the toll that it takes on people.
Yeah, I mean, I think a film, for me, I won't take a film unless I can go very deeply into it and into the characters. I have no desire to cut a superficial film or just something that's like surface level action. I would not be good cutting a superhero film.
Well, superficial is definitely not what I would use to describe Big Short. I know that we're almost at the end of our time here, so I want to ask you about, this film is not that old. It's not even a decade old, but we're 8 years from its release, and we're still talking about it right now. And the film, as you and I were talking about earlier, is as disturbingly relevant as it ever has been. Why do you feel that we are still discussing this film now? Why do you feel that this film has stood the test of the past, 8 years, and why do you think that it will stand the test of time in years to come?
There are a few different levels. One is that what was broken hasn't been fixed. Wall Street is decimating the country. I have a company in New York, and during COVID, our lease came up, and our landlord, which was a hedge fund, tripled our rent. This is the way Wall Street works, and our government seems to be owned by Wall Street. They seem to be systematically unable to make corrections, and the Democrats are every bit as culpable as the Republicans. I firmly believe that. Unfortunately, that's one level. Things haven't been fixed, but on another level, we're all like passengers on this little boat, and there's so many victims in the world, and the victimization hasn't changed, and being able to relate to these characters. I mean, as an editor, it's gratifying that it still holds up, and these people hold up. I wonder whether, if things had changed, if the bankers had gone to jail, would people? And today it was a significantly different world, and there was more equality. Would people still be able to relate to these characters? I hope they would. I hope it would be like a historical document that was fun to watch. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case.
And you even have that moment near the end of the film where you have all the bankers went to jail and everything else, and it was the best case scenario. You show us kind of an alternate reality before it crashing back down to the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
And it is a shame.
Well, more than a shame. I mean, I think the world is dying. I mean, physically, the world is dying, and I think these people, the people who are responsible for so much pain and suffering, are still going about their machinations. I mean, I don't want this to get political, but ultimately, I think all film is political. All great film is political.
It very much is, and it's. I think you hit it right on the head as to why this film has stood the test of time and why it probably will stand the test of time. It's a film very much about a moment in time, but unfortunately, it's still about. Even though it takes place 15 years ago, it was made 8 years ago. It still speaks to the world that we're living in today, and I think that's the beauty of this film, and also what's most tragic about this film as well.
Yeah, I agree.
That's kind of a dour way to close us off today, but this is kind of a dour, tragic film at its essence. Hank, thank you so much for taking the time to explore this film with us today. This has just been amazing getting to explore the process of creating it. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Yeah, and thank you for being interested. It's so often we just work on projects and they're done and they disappear. So I love the fact that you wanted to do this with me, and I love the fact that you really resonate with this film. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody in the audience who's been listening in, and especially thank you to Ace. We're very grateful to be here, and so big thank you to you. Thank you again, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you, Ace. Thank you, everybody.